the class loser of the class, was invited to the 10-year reunion. She came by helicopter with Mafia boss. The silence on the 40th floor of the D'Alessandro Group building was not peaceful. It was heavy, pressurized, and expensive. It was the kind of silence that cost millions of dollars to maintain, insulated by triple-paned glass that turned the screaming chaos of the city of Harborview into a silent, glittering circuit board far below. Lena Hart sat alone in her cubicle, the glow of her dual monitors casting a pale blue light across her face. At 28 years old, she had become an expert at blending into the background. She was a ghost in a machine built of steel and secrets, officially. She was a junior financial analyst handling logistics and payroll for the legitimate shipping arm of the company, unofficially. She was one of the few employees who understood that the numbers she balanced were often cleaning money that had never seen a bank vault. She knew what Marco D'Alessandro was. Everyone in Harborview whispered about the D'Alessandro family, but Lena knew the truth because she saw it in the ledgers. She saw it in the sudden influxes of cash listed as consulting fees, and the shell companies that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. She survived by keeping her head down, doing her work with meticulous perfection, and never asking questions. Compartmentalization was her superpower. She adjusted her glasses and reached for her water bottle, her eyes drifting to the clock in the corner of her screen. It was nearly 8 in the evening. She should have gone home hours ago, but the solitude of the office felt safer than the emptiness of her apartment. A soft chime from her personal email tab broke her concentration. Lena frowned. She rarely received personal emails during work hours. Most of her correspondence was bills or spam. She clicked the tab, and the subject line hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Ridgeview High Class of 2015, 10-year reunion, invitation. Her breath hitched, stopping abruptly in her throat. For a moment, she was not a competent financial analyst in a high-rise office. She was 18 years old again, standing in the locker hallway, her books knocked from her hands, scattering across the linoleum, while laughter echoed off the metal lockers. She stared at the digital invitation. It featured a cheesy graphic of a mortarboard cap and streamers. Come see old friends, relive the memories. Memories, the word tasted like ash in her mouth. A flood of them washed over her, unbidden and violent. She remembered the sound of Chelsea Moore's voice, sharp and sweet as broken glass, calling her loser Lena. She remembered eating lunch in the handicap stall of the second-floor girls' bathroom for 3 straight months because she could not bear the anxiety of sitting alone in the cafeteria. She remembered the tripping, the shoving, the way they made her feel like she took up too much space just by existing. And then there was prom. The memory she had buried deepest of all. The prank that had left her soaking wet, humiliated, and fleeing the gymnasium, while the DJ played an upbeat pop song that she still turned off immediately if she heard it on the radio today. Lena's hand trembled as she hovered the mouse over the delete button. She should delete it. She should burn the digital bridge and pretend she never saw it. But she didn't. Instead, she packed her bag, her movements stiff and mechanical, and left the building. Her apartment was a 40-minute train ride away, located in a neighborhood that was safe enough but nowhere near the luxury of the D'Alessandro Tower. It was small, tidy, and beige. It was the home of a woman who did not want to be noticed. Lena sat on her gray sofa, her knees pulled up to her chest, her laptop balanced on her legs. She had opened the invitation again. Against her better judgment, she clicked the link to the reunion's social media page. It was a mistake. There they were, the curated, polished lives of the people who had made her adolescence a living hell. She scrolled past photos of engagement rings and babies, new cars and vacations to Europe. Then she stopped. Ryan Blake. He was smiling in the photo, leaning against a luxury sedan with a sold sign in the foreground. He looked exactly the same, only filled out, his jawline sharper. Ryan Blake, premier realtor of Harborview. The caption read, "The Golden Boy, the boy she had foolishly crushed on, the boy who had pretended to like her just long enough to lure her into the trap of that humiliating prank." He looked happy. He looked successful. And Chelsea Moore. She was now running a boutique PR firm. Her profile picture showed her holding a glass of champagne, looking effortless and radiant. Lena looked around her quiet living room. She had a good job. She paid her bills. She was independent, but compared to them, she felt small. She felt like the loser they had always told her she was. The shame was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach, unchanged by the passing of a decade. "I'm not going," she whispered to the empty room. "I can't go." The next morning, the D'Alessandro offices were humming with quiet efficiency. Lena was exhausted. She had barely slept, her dreams haunted by the echoing laughter of teenagers. She sat in the small, private conference room adjacent to Marco D'Alessandro's executive suite. She was there to present the quarterly variances for the shipping logistics. It was a routine briefing, one she usually handled with robotic precision, but today, her hands were shaking. Marco D'Alessandro sat at the head of the mahogany table. He was a man who commanded a room simply by existing within it. He was 32 years old, with dark hair swept back from a face that was too hard to be classically handsome, but too striking to look away from. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that cost more than Lena's college tuition, and his eyes, dark, intelligent, and predatory, missed nothing. Lena was halfway through explaining a discrepancy in the fuel surcharges when she lost her train of thought. She stared at the spreadsheet on the screen, the numbers blurring together. Miss. Hart. His voice was low, a smooth baritone that vibrated in the air. Lena snapped her head up. "I apologize. Mr. D'Alessandro, as I was saying, the fuel surcharge in the eastern sector." "Stop." He didn't raise his voice, but the command was absolute. Marco leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at her. "You have read the same line 3 times, Marco said calmly, "and your left hand is trembling." Lena quickly pulled her hand off the table, clasping it in her lap. "I didn't sleep well. I apologize. I can come back later if—" "You are my most efficient analyst," Marco interrupted. "You do not make mistakes. You do not stutter. And you certainly do not look like you are waiting for a guillotine to drop." He stood up. The movement was fluid, like a panther uncoiling from a branch. He walked slowly around the table until he was standing near her chair. He didn't crowd her, but his presence was overwhelming. He smelled of sandalwood, crisp linen, and something uniquely dangerous. "What is it, Lena?" The use of her first name startled her. He almost always called her Miss Hart. "It is personal, sir. It won't affect my work." "It is already affecting your work," he countered. He leaned against the edge of the table, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Tell me." Lena looked down at her hands. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. It was so stupid. It was so high school. How could she explain to a man who ran a criminal empire that she was terrified of a group of realtors and PR consultants? "I received an invitation," she said quietly. "To what?" "My 10-year high school reunion." Marco was silent for a moment. She risked a glance up. He didn't look amused. He looked intensely focused. "And this is cause for distress?" "I wasn't popular," Lena admitted, the words dragging out of her. "I was the class loser. That's what they called me. It wasn't just teasing, it was relentless." Marco's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who?" "Everyone. The popular clique. Ryan Blake. Chelsea Moore." She shrugged, trying to minimize it. "It was a long time ago. It shouldn't matter." "But it does." Marco's voice dropped an octave, becoming softer, more intimate. "I can see it in your eyes. You are afraid of them." "I'm not afraid," Lena lied. "I just don't want to be humiliated again. I don't want to walk into that room and feel like that scared little girl. They made me feel worthless." Marco, and looking at their lives now, they won. They're happy and successful, and I'm just what? Marco prompted gently. "I'm just the girl who hides in the back office," she whispered. Marco pushed off the table. He took a step closer to her chair. "You are the smartest person on this floor. You manage finances that would break the minds of lesser accountants. You have a spine of steel to work in this building and know what you know without running away." He crouched down so he was at eye level with her. The shift in perspective was disarming. Who hurt you the most? Ryan, she confessed, the name tasting bitter. He pretended to like me. He asked me to meet him at the gym on prom night. I thought he was finally seeing me. But when I got there, it was a setup. The whole football team was waiting. They laughed. God, they laughed so hard. A shadow passed over Marco's face. It was a dark, terrifying look that vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a mask of cold resolve. You are going to that reunion, Marco stated. Lena shook her head rapidly. No way, I'm not going. You are going, he repeated, and you are not going alone. Lena blinked. What? I will take you. She let out a nervous, incredulous laugh. You? Mr. D'Alessandro, you can't be serious. You have an empire to run. You don't go to high school reunions and gymnasium ballrooms. It is a hotel ballroom, I assume. Well, yes, the Grand Hotel downtown, but then it is settled, he said, rising to his full height. He looked down at her, a strange light in his eyes. It was a mix of teasing, challenge, and a protective ferocity that made her breath catch. We will go, and we will arrive in a way they will never forget. How? She asked, her voice barely a squeak. The helicopter, he said simply. We will land on the roof. You're joking. Marco's face remained perfectly still. I never joke about logistics. Lena, we will land on the roof. You will walk in with me. And anyone who looks at you with anything other than respect will answer to me. Marco, I can't ask you to do that. You didn't ask, he said. I volunteered. He turned and walked back to his desk, but before he sat down, he paused. He looked at her across the room. Why do you let them live rent-free in your head, Lena? They are ghosts. We are going to exorcise them. Later that afternoon, Lena was called back into his office. She assumed it was for more paperwork, but when she entered, Marco was standing by the window, looking out at the gray skyline. Come here, he said. She approached him slowly. The office felt smaller than usual, charged with an electricity she couldn't name. I noticed you playing with that necklace all morning, he said, nodding to the thin silver chain around her throat. It was a cheap thing, something she had bought for herself years ago. It's a nervous habit, she murmured, her hand flying up to touch the metal. Marco stepped closer. He was so close now that she could feel the heat radiating from his suit. He reached out, his hand large and warm. Lena froze. She thought he was going to touch the necklace, but his fingers brushed the sensitive skin at the nape of her neck. A shiver violently cascaded down her spine. He adjusted the clasp of the chain, his touch lingering longer than necessary. His fingertips were rough, calloused, the hands of a man who had done violence in his life, but his touch was incredibly gentle. You have nothing to be nervous about, he murmured. His voice was right above her. She looked up, and his eyes locked onto hers. The air in the room seemed to thicken, turning to syrup. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that she was sure he could hear. It was a moment of raw, undeniable tension. He wasn't looking at her like an employee. He was looking at her like a man looks at a woman he wants to possess. Panic and desire warred within her. It was too much, too fast. Lena pulled back, stumbling slightly in her heels. I should get back to the ledger. The auditors are coming next week. Marco let his hand drop to his side. The intensity in his eyes didn't fade, but he nodded. Go, but clear your schedule for Friday night. The next 3 days were a blur of anxiety and preparation. Marco didn't just offer a ride, he deployed a team. On Thursday, a stylist named Elena arrived at Lena's apartment. Elena was efficient and kind, ignoring Lena's protests that this was all too much. They spent hours trying on dresses that Marco had apparently paid for. Lena stood before the full-length mirror in her bedroom. The dress was midnight blue, made of a silk material that poured over her body like water. It was tasteful, with long sleeves and a high neck, but the back plunged low, exposing her spine. It was elegant, it was expensive. I look like I'm playing dress-up, Lena whispered, touching her own reflection. I look like a fraud. You look like a queen, Elena corrected, adjusting the hem. Mr. D'Alessandro has excellent taste. He specifically requested this color. He said it would match your eyes. Lena felt a flush rise to her cheeks. He had noticed the color of her eyes? The imposter syndrome was a constant hum in the back of her mind. She kept waiting for someone to burst in and tell her to take off the dress, that she wasn't good enough for silk and diamonds. She felt like the class loser wrapped in expensive packaging. Friday night arrived with a storm of wind. Lena stood on the private helipad atop the D'Alessandro Tower. The city was a grid of amber and white lights stretching out to the dark water of the harbor. The wind whipped her hair, which had been styled in soft waves, and she hugged her arms around her waist, shivering. She was terrified, not of the flight, but of the landing, of seeing Ryan, of seeing Chelsea, of the moment the illusion shattered. The sound of a heavy door opening behind her made her turn. Marco stepped onto the roof. He was wearing a tuxedo. It was tailored to perfection, emphasizing the width of his shoulders and the taper of his waist. He looked devastating. He looked like the kind of danger that women wrote songs about. He walked toward her, his stride confident against the wind. He stopped a foot away, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe. "Breathtaking," he said. The word was torn from him, raw and honest. Lena looked down. "I feel like I'm going to throw up." Marco stepped into her space. He placed a hand on the small of her back. The warmth of his palm seeped through the silk of her dress, grounding her. "Look at me," he commanded softly. She looked up. "That girl they mocked? The one you are holding on to so tightly?" Marco shook his head. "She is gone. Lena, she died the moment you learned to survive in my world. The woman standing before me is strong. She is beautiful, and she is mine to protect tonight." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "If they cannot see that, they are blind, and I do not have patience for blind men." The helicopter's rotors began to spin faster, the whine increasing to a roar. The wind battered them, but Marco was a solid wall shielding her from the gale. "Ready?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp." He guided her toward the aircraft. Lena climbed inside, the smell of leather and aviation fuel filling her nose. Marco climbed in beside her, buckling her in with efficient hands. As the helicopter lifted off, the stomach-dropping sensation of ascent mixed with her nerves. The D'Alessandro Tower fell away beneath them. The city opened up, a sprawling map of light. Lena's hands were clenched in her lap. She felt a large, warm hand cover hers. She looked at Marco. He wasn't looking at the view. He was watching her profile. She turned her hand over, gripping his forearm. She could feel the hard muscle beneath the tuxedo jacket. It was an anchor. He leaned close to be heard over the noise of the rotors. His lips brushed the shell of her ear, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "Don't let go," he said, his breath warm against her skin. "I won't," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. His scent surrounded her, drowning out the fear. For the first time all week, the anxiety of the reunion was overshadowed by something else entirely, a quiet, burning desire that terrified her more than any high school bully ever could. Ahead of them, the lights of the Grand Hotel drew closer, the rooftop landing pad waiting for their arrival. Lena took a deep breath, tightened her grip on the mafia boss's arm, and prepared to face her past. The helicopter descended like a dark bird of prey, the thump of its rotors vibrating through the soles of Lena Hart's high heels. Below them, the rooftop terrace of the Grand Hotel was awash in the warm glow of string lights and the harsh, strobing flash of smartphones. Lena gripped the leather armrest, her knuckles white, through the glass. She could see them. The class of 2015, they had spilled out onto the terrace, drawn by the noise and the spectacle. They were holding up their phones, recording the descent. 10 years ago, they had recorded her crying in a hallway. Now, they were recording her arrival in a multi-million-dollar machine. The pilot set the aircraft down with a gentle bump that belied the power of the engine. The rotors began to slow, their roar fading to a rhythmic whoop, whoop, whoop that sliced through the evening air. "Ready?" Marco's voice was calm, cutting through the noise inside the cabin. Lena took a shaky breath. "As I'll ever be." The co-pilot jumped out to open the passenger door. A gust of wind, generated by the dying spin of the blades, rushed into the cabin, tossing Lena's hair. Marco nodded to her. It was time. Lena stepped out first. Her midnight blue silk dress caught the terrace lights, rippling around her legs like liquid sapphire. She stood tall, the wind whipping the fabric against her frame, instinctively raising a hand to shield her eyes from the glare of the flashes. For a moment there was only the sound of the wind. Then a murmur started. It began as a ripple and grew into a wave of disbelief. Is that Lena? No way. Lena Hart? She heard her name whispered in tones of shock. She saw jaws drop. She saw the recognition dawn on faces she hadn't seen in a decade. The girl who used to trip over her own feet, who wore ill-fitting sweaters to hide her body, was standing on a helipad looking like she owned the skyline. Then Marco stepped out behind her. If Lena was the beauty, Marco was the force of nature. He emerged from the dark interior of the helicopter with a predator's grace. Buttoning his tuxedo jacket with one hand, he did not look at the crowd. He looked at the perimeter, scanning the rooftop with cold, calculating efficiency before his gaze settled on Lena. He moved to her side, his presence instantaneous and overwhelming. He placed his hand on the small of her back, a gesture that was possessive, protective, and undeniably intimate. "Chin up," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Walk like you own the building." They moved toward the terrace doors. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a wide berth. The smartphones were still recording, tracking their every movement. Lena felt the weight of 100 eyes on her, but the warmth of Marco's hand on her spine was a steadying fire. She didn't stumble. She didn't look down. She walked straight ahead, her heels clicking rhythmically on the concrete pavers. They entered the ballroom, and the atmosphere shifted from the chaotic wind of the rooftop to the humid, perfumed air of a high-stakes social event. The room was decorated in gold and black, with round tables cluttering the floor and a DJ booth set up on a small stage. As they stepped onto the carpet, the murmuring followed them inside. People clustered in tight circles, their eyes darting toward Marco, then leaning in to whisper furiously to one another. The pretense of the reunion, the fake smiles, the exaggerated greetings, seemed to pause, holding its breath in the face of this unexpected variable. Well, well, well. The voice was high, sharp, and instantly recognizable. Chelsea Moore detached herself from a group of women near the entrance. She looked exactly as Lena remembered, only more expensive. Her blonde hair was a perfect, immobile helmet of curls, and her red dress was cut aggressively low. She held a champagne flute like a weapon. "Lena Hart," Chelsea said, her eyes raking over Lena's dress, assessing the cost, the fit, and the way Marco's hand rested on the silk. "I almost didn't recognize you. You finally grew into yourself." It was a classic Chelsea compliment, a barb wrapped in sugar. It implied that the person she had been before was defective, unfinished, 10 years ago. Lena would have stammered a thank you. Today, she felt Marco's thumb stroke the fabric of her dress, a silent reminder of who was standing beside her. "Hello, Chelsea," Lena said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You look exactly the same." Chelsea's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She stepped in for a hug, a brittle, airy thing where their bodies barely touched. "And who is this?" she asked, pulling back and turning her hungry gaze on Marco. "You certainly didn't find him in Ridgeview." "Marco D'Alessandro," Marco said. He did not offer his hand. He simply stood there, radiating a cold, dark charisma that made Chelsea take a subtle step back. "D'Alessandro?" Chelsea repeated, her eyes widening. The name carried weight in this city, usually whispered in conjunction with construction contracts and labor disputes that disappeared overnight. "Oh, I see. Well, welcome to the madness." Before Chelsea could dig deeper, a man pushed through the crowd. "Lena? No way." Ryan Blake approached them with a wide, incredulous grin. He was holding a beer, his face flushed with alcohol and excitement. He wore a suit that was trendy but ill-fitting around the shoulders, a stark contrast to Marco's bespoke tailoring. "Ryan," Lena said, her stomach tightening. The memory of the gym, the prank, the laughter, it all surged forward. "You look incredible," Ryan said, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe his luck. He stepped into her personal space, ignoring Marco entirely. "I mean, wow. We never really talked back then, did we? I feel like I missed out." The lie was so bold it almost took Lena's breath away. Never really talked? He had lured her to the gym with a fake love note. He had been the architect of her worst nightmare. "We talked," Lena said quietly. "I remember it quite vividly." Ryan laughed, a hollow, booming sound. "High school, right? Ancient history. We should catch up properly. I'm in real estate now, doing big numbers. I could show you some listings if you're looking to upgrade." His eyes dropped to her chest, then back up to her face. A shameless appraisal that made Lena's skin crawl. Marco moved. It was a subtle shift, a mere tilt of his head, but the temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. He didn't step forward, but his stillness became predatory. His eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian, locked onto Ryan's face. He was silently assessing the other man, dissecting him, measuring the threat level and finding it pathetic but annoying. "She is not looking for listings," Marco said. His voice was smooth, devoid of any jagged edges, yet it hit Ryan like a physical shove. Ryan blinked, finally acknowledging the man standing beside Lena. He looked at Marco, then at Marco's hand on Lena's back, and his smile wavered. "Right, just being friendly. Man, it's a reunion." "Keep it friendly," Marco advised. It wasn't a threat. Technically, it was an instruction. Ryan swallowed, took a step back, and raised his beer in a mock salute before retreating into the safety of the crowd. Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me for handling insects," Marco replied softly, guiding her deeper into the room. They moved toward the bar, navigating the sea of forced pleasantries. Lena shook hands, nodded at people who had once thrown spitballs at her, and tried to maintain the facade of the successful, unbothered woman. But the tension was wearing on her. As they waited for water, Lena refused to drink alcohol, needing her wits sharp. Her eyes scanned the perimeter of the room. It was a habit she had picked up from Marco in just a few hours, near the service entrance. Leaning against the dark wood paneling of the bar stood two men. They did not look like Ridgeview alumni. They were older, with hardened faces and suits that were cut to conceal weapons rather than to flatter their physiques. They weren't drinking. They weren't talking to anyone. Their eyes were fixed on Marco. Lena nudged Marco's arm gently. "Marco," she whispered, keeping her voice level. 3:00, by the service door. Marco didn't look immediately. He took a glass of sparkling water from the bartender, thanked him, and then casually turned his body as he handed the glass to Lena. The movement allowed him to sweep his gaze over the men without making direct eye contact. "I see them," he murmured. "Who are they?" "Not friends." Marco shifted his stance. He moved smoothly, placing himself directly between Lena and the men. It was a human shield maneuver, executed with such casual grace that no one else in the room would have noticed. But Lena noticed. She saw the way his muscles tensed beneath the jacket, the way his right hand hovered just inches from his waistband. "Are we in danger?" she asked, her heart beginning to thud against her ribs. "You are safe," Marco said, though he didn't answer the question about danger. "But the air in here is stale. Let's get some fresh air." It wasn't a request. He guided her away from the bar, away from the prying eyes of the two men, and toward the French doors that led to a smaller, more private side balcony. They stepped out into the night air. It was crisp and cold, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the ballroom. The noise of the party was muffled here, reduced to a dull thrum behind the glass. Lena walked to the stone railing, wrapping her arms around herself. The adrenaline of the arrival was fading, leaving her shivering and raw. "I'm sorry," she said, looking out at the city lights. "I dragged you into this ridiculous high school drama, and now..." Now there are men watching you. I shouldn't have come." She felt a weight settle over her shoulders. Marco had removed his tuxedo jacket and draped it over her. It was heavy, warm, and smelled intoxicatingly of him, sandalwood and steel. "Lena." He turned her around gently. His white dress shirt was crisp against the night, his tie loosened slightly. He reached out, placing a finger under her chin and tilting her face up until she was forced to look at him. "You did not drag me anywhere," he said firmly. "I chose to be here. I chose to be with you. But those men? Forget them," Marco commanded softly. "Right now. There is only us." His eyes searched hers, dark and intense. The moonlight cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the hard line of his jaw and the softness of his mouth. He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. Lena's breath hitched. The cold air suddenly felt hot. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, could see the pulse beating at the base of his throat. "You look." He paused, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. "You look magnificent tonight, Lena. Seeing you walk into that room, it made me want to burn the place down just so no one else could look at you." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Marco." He leaned down. His face was inches from hers. His gaze dropped to her lips, hungry and focused. Lena's eyes fluttered shut, her body swaying toward him. Drawn by a magnetic pull she couldn't resist. She felt his breath on her cheek, warm and inviting. "Ladies and gentlemen," the booming voice of the PA system shattered the moment. "Please take your seats. The presentation is about to begin." They sprang apart. Marco looked toward the closed doors, a flash of genuine irritation crossing his face. Lena let out a shaky breath, her lips tingling with the ghost of a kiss that hadn't happened. "We should go inside," she whispered, though every fiber of her being wanted to stay on that balcony. Marco adjusted his cuffs, the mask of control sliding back into place. "After you." They returned to the ballroom and found their assigned table near the back. The lights dimmed almost immediately. A large projection screen descended from the ceiling. "Welcome, class of 2015, the class president announced from the stage. "Let's take a walk down memory lane." Music started, a sentimental pop ballad from their senior year. Photos began to cycle on the screen. At first, it was standard fare. Football games, pep rallies, groups of smiling cheerleaders. But then, the tone shifted. The reunion committee. It thought it would be funny to show the awkward phases. A photo of Lena appeared. It was from sophomore year. Her skin was broken out in angry acne. Her braces were clunky, and her hair was frizzy. She was clutching a binder to her chest, looking terrified of the camera. A ripple of laughter went through the room. Lena froze in her seat. Her hands gripped the tablecloth. The slide changed. It was a video clip. It was the hallway incident. Lena was on the floor, books scattered, scrambling to pick them up while legs walked past, kicking the papers further away. In the video, she was crying. The laughter in the room grew louder. A pocket of guys near the front, Ryan's table, was pointing and snickering. "Oh man, classic heart," someone said loud enough to be heard. Lena felt the blood drain from her face. It was happening again. 10 years later, she was sitting in the dark, being laughed at. She felt small. She felt ugly. She shrank into her chair, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. Beside her, Marco went rigid. His jaw tightened until a muscle feathered in his cheek. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at the people laughing. His expression was terrifying, a cold, silent fury that promised violence. He leaned in close to her ear. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, barely controlled. "Say the word, and we walk out, or I shut this down. Your choice." Lena looked at the screen, then at the laughing faces of her tormentors. She looked at Ryan, who was wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. Something inside her snapped, not a break, but a hardening. "No," she whispered. Marco looked at her, surprised. "No? No," she said, louder this time. She turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears but burning with a newfound defiance. "I'm not running away. Not this time. Let them laugh. It's all they have." She sat up straighter, smoothing the silk of her dress. Her hands were trembling violently under the table, but her chin was high. Marco watched her for a long moment. The fury in his eyes softened into something resembling awe. He reached under the table and took her trembling hand in his, engulfing it in warmth and strength. He didn't say a word, but his grip was an anchor. The lights came back up. The presentation ended. The awkward tension lingered in the air as people glanced back at Lena, expecting to see her crying or gone. Instead, they saw her sitting stoically beside the most dangerous-looking man in the room. As the dinner service began, Lena excused herself to go to the bar for another water. She needed a moment to compose herself away from the table. She was waiting for the bartender when Chelsea appeared again. The PR queen had evidently had a few more glasses of champagne. Her eyes were glassy and mean. "You know," Chelsea slurred slightly, leaning against the bar, "it's a nice dress." "Lena, really, but we all know how this works." Lena didn't look at her. "How what works, Chelsea? The handsome, rich older guy? The sudden upgrade in wardrobe?" Chelsea smirked. "I didn't know you had it in you to be an escort. Good for you. Finding a sugar daddy to pay your bills. I guess that's one way to fix your life." The insult hung in the air, gross and heavy. Before Lena could respond, a shadow fell over them. Marco was there. He hadn't been behind Lena a second ago, but he was there now. He stood close behind Lena, looming over Chelsea. "What did you say?" His voice was very low. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient noise of the party like a razor blade. Chelsea blinked, looking up at him. Her smirk faltered. "I was just joking. It's a joke." "I do not find it funny," Marco said. He took a step closer to Chelsea. She backed up until her hips hit the bar. "Let me be clear," Marco said, his eyes boring into hers. "Miss Hart is a woman of intelligence, grace, and worth. Attributes you seem to lack entirely. If you speak to her with disrespect again, if you even look at her the wrong way, I will make sure your little PR firm loses every client it has by morning. Do you understand me?" He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He simply projected absolute, undeniable power. Chelsea paled. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. She looked from Marco to Lena, terror dawning in her eyes. She nodded quickly, then turned and scurried away, disappearing into the crowd. Lena looked up at Marco. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Marco said, his face still hard. "I did." He turned to the bartender to order her water. As he did, a man in a dark suit, one of the men Lena had seen earlier, brushed past Marco's back. It looked accidental to anyone watching. A stumble in a crowded room, but as the man passed, he leaned in. He murmured something in Italian, a rapid string of syllables that was lost under the thumping bass of the music. Lena didn't speak Italian, but she heard one word clearly. "Lena." The man kept walking, disappearing toward the exit. Marco froze. His hand clenched around the glass of water the bartender had just set down. It happened in a split second. A flash of pure, unadulterated fear crossing his face before he locked it down behind a mask of stone. He turned to Lena. The romantic softness from the balcony was gone. The righteous anger from the bar was gone. In their place was the cold, hard calculation of a soldier behind enemy lines. "We need to be careful," he said softly. "Marco?" Lena asked, her pulse spiking. "What did he say?" "Nothing good." He handed her the water, but his eyes were scanning the room, checking the exits, checking the crowd. "Stay close to me. Do not leave my side for a second. This isn't just a reunion anymore." Lena looked at the festive balloons, the dancing classmates, the facade of a normal night. It all felt thin now, like paper stretched over a precipice. The danger she had sensed in the office, the danger she knew existed in Marco's world, had followed them here, and it knew her name. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, casting the space in a wash of deep violet and gold. The DJ, sensing the shift in the room's energy, or perhaps just following a predetermined playlist, faded out the upbeat top 40 hits and brought in a slow, melancholic melody. It was a song about lost time and found love, the kind that demanded contact. For Lena Hart, the change in atmosphere was not romantic. It was a trigger. The darkness of the room seemed to stretch, pulling her back into the recesses of her memory where she kept the things she tried so hard to forget. Flashback. She was 16. It was a Tuesday. She found the note taped to her locker, written on blue-lined paper. "Meet me behind the bleachers after practice. I have liked you all semester." Ryan, her heart had soared. She had spent the entire afternoon in a haze of giddy disbelief. She walked to the football field as the sun was setting, clutching the note like a lifeline. When she rounded the corner of the metal bleachers, she didn't find a romance. She found the entire defensive line waiting. They didn't beat her up. That would have been easier to explain. They just laughed. They laughed until they were gasping for air, pointing at her hopeful face, asking if she really thought a guy like Ryan Blake would look twice at a girl who wore oversized sweaters to hide herself. The sound of that laughter was a physical thing, a jagged blade scraping against her bones. Flashback, the cafeteria, junior year. The tray was heavy with the generic pasta of the day. She was walking to the empty table in the corner, her safe zone. A foot shot out, not an accident, a calculated trip. The crash echoed like a gunshot. Marinara sauce splattered across her jeans. The silence that followed lasted only a second before the roar of applause broke out. "Nice moves!" "Heart!" someone screamed. She had to kneel in the mess to pick up her silverware, her face burning so hot she thought her skin might melt. Flashback. Senior year. She was crying in the hallway after a teacher had berated her in front of the class. She thought she was alone, but a phone camera had been peering through the gap in the lockers. By fourth period, the video was everywhere. Captioned, "The Waterworks Show starring loser Lena." The comments were a scrolling feed of cruelty that she read until her eyes blurred. "Lena?" The voice cut through the fog of the past, anchoring her back to the present. She blinked. Focusing on the table in front of her, the white tablecloth came into sharp relief. She looked up. Marco D'Alessandro was standing beside her chair. He wasn't looking at the past. He was looking at her. His hand was extended, palm up. A silent invitation. "They are playing a waltz," Marco said softly. "It would be a shame to waste it." Lena looked at his hand, then out at the dance floor. Couples were drifting toward the center. Chelsea and her husband. Ryan and a woman Lena didn't recognize. The old fear gripped her throat. If she walked out there, she would be on display. If she tripped. If she looked foolish. "I can't," she whispered. "Everyone will watch." "Let them watch," Marco replied. His smile was small, patient, and devastatingly confident. "Let them see what they missed." He didn't withdraw his hand. He waited. Lena looked at the man who had flown her here in a helicopter, the man who had silenced Chelsea with a few quiet words. He was offering her a shield. All she had to do was take it. Slowly, fighting the tremor in her fingers, she placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and firm. He pulled her up from the chair with an effortless grace, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm as he led her toward the dance floor. As they stepped into the circle of light, Lena felt the eyes of the room shift toward them. She stiffened, her shoulders rising defensively. She expected the laughter. She expected the trip. But Marco didn't let her shrink. He turned her to face him, stepping into her personal space with an authority that stole the breath from her lungs. He placed his right hand on her waist, not hovering politely, but claiming the space. His fingers splayed across the silk of her dress, the heat of his palm seeping through to her skin. "Look at me," he commanded gently. She lifted her eyes to his. "Just me," he murmured. "The rest of them are furniture." He began to move. He was an exceptional dancer. He led her with subtle shifts of his weight and pressure from his hand, guiding her through the steps so smoothly that she couldn't have stumbled if she tried. Slowly, the tension began to bleed out of her frame. Marco pulled her closer, eliminating the polite distance usually reserved for high school acquaintances. Her body aligned with his. She could feel the solid wall of his chest against her breasts, the slow, rhythmic thud of his heart that seemed to beat in time with the music. Her cheek brushed the expensive fabric of his tuxedo jacket, smelling the sandalwood and the faint, metallic scent of the night air that clung to him. She closed her eyes for a moment. letting the sensation wash over her. She wasn't the class loser here. She was a woman in the arms of a man who made her feel safe. The laughter of the past faded, replaced by the steady strength of his hold. She opened her eyes and found him watching her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "You are doing beautifully," he whispered. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "I know," Marco said, "but you are doing it anyway. That is what matters." For a minute, everything was perfect. The music, the movement, the man. Then a tap on Marco's shoulder shattered the bubble. "Mind if I cut in?" Lena froze. She knew that voice. Ryan Blake stood there, a cocky grin plastered on his face. He swayed slightly, the smell of bourbon wafting off him. Marco stopped moving. He didn't let go of Lena. He looked at Ryan with eyes that had turned into chips of flint. "Yes," Marco said coolly. "I do mind." Ryan laughed, slapping Marco on the arm as if they were old buddies. "Come on, man, don't be greedy. I haven't seen Lena in 10 years. We have catching up to do." He looked at Lena, his eyes glazing over with a mix of nostalgia and alcohol. "Come on, Lele. One dance for old time's sake?" Lele, the nickname he had used right before he broke her heart. Lena looked at Marco. She saw the violence coiled in his muscles. He was ready to refuse, perhaps forcibly, but she also saw the people watching. If Marco caused a scene now, the rumors would be uncontrollable. "It's okay," Lena said, her voice tight. "Just one song." Marco looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't like it. She could tell by the way his jaw worked, but he nodded once, a sharp, singular motion. "One song," Marco said to Ryan. The words sounded like a contract, one with severe penalties for breach. Marco stepped back, but he didn't leave the floor. He stood on the edge of the circle, his hands clasped behind his back, watching like a sentinel. Ryan grabbed Lena's hand. His grip was clammy and loose, nothing like Marco's dry, firm hold. He pulled her too close, his steps clumsy and offbeat. "So," Ryan said, breathing bourbon into her face, "you really landed on your feet, huh? Who's the guy? He looks like he takes himself way too seriously." "He's my boss," Lena said, trying to keep a respectful distance between their bodies. "Boss? Nice," Ryan winked. "I bet that's a fun arrangement, but seriously, Lena, you look great. I always knew you had potential." "You certainly didn't act like it," Lena said, surprising herself. Ryan waved his hand dismissively. "We were kids. Kids are stupid, but look at me now. I was top seller in the Tri-County area last month. I drive a Porsche. I've got a condo downtown. I'm doing big things." He spun her around clumsily. Lena stumbled, but caught herself. "That's nice. Ryan," she said, her tone flat. "I'm just saying," Ryan continued, oblivious to her discomfort. "You look good. I look good. We should, you know, grab a drink later, without Mr. Tall, dark, and intense over there." Lena looked over Ryan's shoulder at Marco. He hadn't moved. His gaze was a laser focused entirely on Ryan's hands. Suddenly, the contrast was blinding. Ryan was a boy pretending to be a man, measuring his worth in car brands and sales awards. Marco was a force of nature who didn't need to brag because his power was self-evident. Ryan's compliments felt like slime. Marco's silence felt like worship. "The song is over," Lena said abruptly, pulling away before the music actually stopped. "Hey, wait, don't be like that," Ryan protested, reaching for her. "I need the restroom." She lied, turning on her heel and walking briskly away from the dance floor. She didn't go to the restroom. She went to the hallway that connected the ballroom to the lobby, needing to escape the suffocating air of the party. She leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths, trying to calm the shaking in her hands. Footsteps hurried up behind her. "Lena, hold up." It was Ryan. He had followed her. He cornered her against the wall, placing one hand on the plaster beside her head. It was a movie pose, something he probably thought looked smooth, but in reality, it was trapping and aggressive. "Why are you running away?" Ryan asked, his voice slurring. "I'm trying to be nice here." "I'm not running," Lena said, ducking under his arm to move away. "I just want some space." Ryan stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Is it because of him? That guy?" He laughed bitterly. Come on, Lena, I've seen guys like that. He's trouble. He's got bad news written all over him. You don't want to get mixed up with someone dangerous. You don't know anything about him, Lena snapped. I know he looks at you like he owns you, Ryan sneered, stepping closer, crowding her space. I could help you. You know, I could take you out of here. We could go to my place. I could show you a real good time. Better than some stiff in a tuxedo. Old panic flared in Lena's chest, the smell of alcohol, the entitlement, the way he wouldn't let her pass. It was high school all over again, but with an adult edge of menace. Ryan, move, she said, her voice trembling. Don't be a bitch. Lena, I'm offering you a... Step back. The voice came from the shadows at the end of the hall. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo. It was hard as stone and cold as the grave. Marco emerged from the dim light. He walked slowly. His hands relaxed at his sides, but there was a kinetic energy radiating from him that screamed violence. Ryan turned, startled. He tried to laugh it off. Whoa, easy there, buddy. We're just talking. You are not talking, Marco said, stopping 3 feet away. You're cornering a woman who has asked you to move. It's a misunderstanding, Ryan said, his bravado faltering under Marco's gaze. We're old friends. You are not friends, Marco corrected, and you are going to step away from her, now. Or what? Ryan challenged, though his voice cracked. You gonna hit me? Marco smiled. It was a terrifying expression. It didn't reach his eyes. If I wanted to hit you, you would already be on the floor wondering why you could not taste your teeth. I am asking you politely to walk away before I decide that politeness is a waste of my time. The air in the hallway seemed to freeze. Ryan looked at Marco, really looked at him, and saw what Lena had seen in the office, the steel, the darkness, the absolute capability for harm. Ryan paled. He swallowed hard, looked at Lena one last time with a mix of resentment and fear, and then stepped back. Whatever, Ryan muttered. She's not worth the trouble anyway. He turned and scurried back toward the ballroom, his tail between his legs. Lena let out a shuddering breath, her knees sagging. Marco was beside her instantly. He didn't touch her, but he shielded her body with his. Did he touch you? No, Lena whispered. Just... Crowded me? Marco stared down the hallway where Ryan had disappeared, his eyes narrowing. He's lucky. Lena looked at Marco's profile. The polished, corporate executive mask had slipped. Beneath it was the edge she had sensed but never fully seen. He was dangerous. He was lethal. And he was using all of that darkness to stand between her and the world. Come, Marco said, offering his arm again. It is too loud here. He led her away from the ballroom, down a corridor to a side lounge called the Velvet Room. It was empty, save for a few low armchairs and a dormant fireplace. The quiet was a physical relief. They sat on a plush leather sofa, not touching but close enough to feel the warmth of each other. You were right, Lena said, breaking the silence. About Ryan, about all of it. Marco sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was a human gesture, one that made him seem less like a statue and more like a man. I wanted to break his arm, Marco admitted quietly. When he put his hand on the wall, I mapped out 3 different ways to snap the bone. Lena looked at him, shocked but strangely not afraid. Why didn't you? Because you are here, Marco said, turning to face her, and because tonight is about you reclaiming your power, not me displaying mine. He paused, looking down at his hands. You noticed the men earlier, the ones at the bar. Yes, Lena said, and the one in the hallway. They are watching me, Marco said. My business, the D'Alessandro Group. We have competitors, people who want what we have. I am not just a wealthy man. Lena, I walk in a world that has very sharp edges. I know, Lena said softly. I handle the logistics. I see the shell companies. I see the money moving in circles. I'm not naive. Marco looked at her, surprise registering in his dark eyes. You knew? And you stayed? I needed the job, she said. And I felt safe there. Safer than I felt out here, anyway. She let out a bitter laugh. That's pathetic, isn't it? I felt safer in a criminal front than I did in a high school reunion. It is not pathetic, Marco said fiercely. "It is," she insisted, her voice breaking. "I've always been so small, so powerless. I let them treat me like dirt for 4 years. I let Ryan make me feel like nothing tonight. I'm just the same scared girl I always was." Marco shifted. He moved closer on the sofa, invading her space in the most welcome way possible. "You are wrong," he said. He reached out and took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. His grip was tight, desperate. "When I first saw you in the office," Marco said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper, "the auditors were tearing the department apart. Everyone was panicking. But you were sitting there, calm, organized, handing them files and answering questions without blinking. I saw steel in you then. Lena, under all that fear, there is a spine of pure iron." Lena looked at their joined hands, the contrast of his large, tanned hand against her pale, slender fingers was striking. "I don't feel like iron," she whispered. "Then let me feel it for you," Marco said. He leaned in. His forehead rested briefly against hers, a gesture of intimacy that felt heavier than a kiss. She could feel his breath on her skin. "I have been thinking about this," he confessed, his voice shaking slightly. "About you. About us. Since the moment you walked into my office with that necklace." "Me too," Lena breathed. The conversation dissolved into a heavy, charged silence. The air between them crackled. They turned their faces toward each other, noses brushing. Marco's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was reverent, as if she were something breakable and precious. "Lena." He groaned. He closed the distance. His lips brushed hers tentatively at first, a question asked in the darkness. Lena responded, pressing into him, and the question became an answer. The kiss deepened. It wasn't polite. It was hungry. It was the collision of two people who had been circling each other in the dark. Marco's other hand slid into her hair, tilting her head back, deepening the angle. Lena clutched the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer. Needing to be as close to him as physics would allow, heat flooded through her veins, a molten river that washed away the shame of the past. She wasn't a loser. She wasn't a victim. She was a woman desired by a king. But it was too much. Too fast. The intensity of it scared her. She pulled back, gasping for air. Her lips were swollen, her eyes wide. She stammered. "I'm scared." Marco didn't try to pull her back. He stayed close, his eyes searching hers. "Of me? No?" she whispered. "Of how much I want this. Of what it means." Marco opened his mouth to speak, to reassure her, but a harsh buzzing sound cut through the moment. He froze. He pulled his phone from his inner pocket. He glanced at the screen, and the passion vanished from his face, replaced instantly by the cold mask of the boss. It was a text message. A string of numbers. A code. "We need to leave," Marco said. His voice was no longer the voice of the man who had just kissed her. It was sharp, commanded. "Now." "What is it?" Lena asked. The cold reality crashing back in. "Arrival crew," Marco said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "They are close. Closer than I thought. My security team just spotted a spotter vehicle 2 blocks away." He extended his hand to her. "Come, we will go out the back." Lena looked at his hand, then she looked toward the door that led back to the ballroom. "No," she said. Marco paused. "Lena, this is not a negotiation. It is dangerous." "I know," she said, standing up on her own. "But if we leave now, if I sneak out the back door, then I'm running away again. I'm letting Ryan and Chelsea and all of them think they won. I'm letting them think I disappeared because I couldn't handle it. This is not about them," Marco argued. "This is about bullets. I want to walk out the front door," Lena said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I want to say goodbye. I want to leave on my terms, even if it's messy." Marco stared at her. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw. He saw the iron he had told her was there. "You are infuriating," he muttered, but there was a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Fine, but we move fast, and you stay glued to my side." They left the lounge and stepped back into the periphery of the ballroom. The party was in full swing. oblivious to the threat tightening around the building. As they moved toward the main exit, Lena scanned the room. Her eyes caught movement near the concierge desk. It was the man from the bar, the one who had whispered in Italian. He was speaking to a hotel staff member, gesturing toward the main doors. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Marco across the room. He didn't smile, he just tapped his earpiece. Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Marco," she whispered, gripping his arm. "He's talking to the staff." "I see him," Marco said, his body tense as a coiled spring. The reunion wasn't just a party anymore. It was a cage, and the door was about to slam shut. The heavy, ornate brass locks of the Grand Hotel's main entrance slid home with a resonant thud that was felt rather than heard over the music. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised purple, and rain began to lash against the plate glass windows like handfuls of gravel. Inside the ballroom, the lights flickered briefly before stabilizing. The DJ cut the music, the sudden silence jarring the crowd of laughing alumni. "Ladies and gentlemen," the DJ's voice boomed, overly cheerful and slightly distorted by the microphone feedback. "It looks like Mother Nature is crashing the party. Management has locked the main doors for security reasons due to the high winds. We are keeping everyone safe from the weather until the storm passes. So, grab another drink and keep dancing." A collective groan went up from the crowd, followed by nervous laughter. People shrugged, turning back to their conversations, accepting the inconvenience as nothing more than bad weather. Marco did not shrug. He stood perfectly still near a decorative pillar, his body angled to shield Lena from the room. His eyes were not on the rain-streaked windows. They were on the security guards stationed at the exits. They weren't looking at the storm. They were looking at the guests, scanning faces with a grim intensity that had nothing to do with wind speeds. "It is a lie," Marco said softly, his voice a low rumble in Lena's ear. Lena looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What?" "The locks," Marco explained, his gaze darting to the service corridor. "They are magnetic containment locks. You use them to keep people in, not to keep weather out. We're trapped." Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at Lena's skin. She followed his gaze toward the bar. The two men in suits were there, but they were no longer idling. One of them was speaking into a radio hidden in his cuff, his eyes fixed on Marco. Lena took a step closer to the pillar, trying to make herself smaller. As she moved, the drift of the music lulled, and a fragment of conversation from the suited men carried over the low hum of the room. "Target is isolated near the east pillar. Secure the girl if necessary, but D'Alessandro is the priority. Do not let him leave the floor." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Lena grabbed Marco's arm, her fingers digging into his tuxedo jacket. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about the reunion. It wasn't about her being a loser or a success. It wasn't about high school petty dramas. "It's you," she whispered, horror dawning in her eyes. "They aren't here for the party. They're here for you." Marco looked down at her, his expression tight. He didn't deny it. "Oh, God," Lena breathed, guilt washing over her like acid. "I did this. I sent the invitation. I made us come here. I dragged you into the open. You're the target, and I led you right into the trap." "Lena, stop," Marco commanded, his voice sharp. "You did not know." "I should have known," she hissed, tears stinging her eyes. "You told me it was dangerous. You told me people were watching, and I was so obsessed with proving something to Ryan and Chelsea that I didn't care. I put a target on your back." "We do not have time for guilt," Marco said, scanning the room. "We need to move." He took her hand, his grip crushing, and began to steer her toward the service corridor. It was a gamble. The main exits were blocked, but the kitchen staff had to have a way out. They made it 10 feet before the path was blocked. One of the suited men stepped out from behind a heavy velvet curtain. He was large, with a neck that seemed to disappear into his shoulders. He didn't draw a weapon, too many witnesses, but his stance was unmistakable. "Mr. D'Alessandro," the man said, his voice gravelly. "A word, please. In private." Marco stopped. He didn't retreat, but he shifted his weight, placing Lena fully behind him. "I am busy," Marco said, his tone bored, arrogant, and dangerous. "Step aside." "It wasn't a request," the man said, reaching out to grab Marco's arm. It was a mistake. Marco moved with a speed that blurred in the dim light. He slapped the man's hand away, stepped inside his guard, and delivered a short, sharp shove to the man's solar plexus. It wasn't a brawl, it was a physics lesson. The large man wheezed, stumbling back into a waiter carrying a tray of empty glasses. The tray crashed to the floor, shattering glass and drawing the attention of half the room. "Hey!" someone shouted. "Fight!" a drunken alumnus yelled from the back. Chaos rippled through the ballroom. Before Marco could press the advantage, 3 uniformed hotel security guards materialized from the shadows. They weren't the regular staff. They moved with too much precision. "Sir, you need to come with us," the lead guard said, stepping between Marco and the wheezing man. "You're causing a disturbance." "He attacked me," Marco said calmly, adjusting his cuffs. "We need to de-escalate," the guard insisted, his hand resting ominously on his belt. "There is a private room down the hall. We are going to separate you from the guests until things calm down." Marco's eyes narrowed. He looked at the guards, then at the blocked exits, then at Lena, who was trembling behind him. He calculated the odds. A fight here, in the middle of the ballroom, would get innocent people hurt, and Lena was in the line of fire. "Fine," Marco said, his voice like ice. "But she comes with me. Sir, it might be better if—" "She comes with me," Marco repeated, the command leaving no room for argument. "Or we finish this right here, and I promise you, the cleanup will be expensive." The guard hesitated, glanced at the suited man who was still catching his breath, and nodded. "Fine. This way?" They were marched out of the ballroom, down a narrow service hallway that smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. They were ushered into a small conference room used for staff meetings. It was dim, lit only by the emergency track lighting. A long oval table dominated the space, surrounded by cheap rolling chairs. "Wait here," the guard said. He stepped out. The door clicked shut. Then came the sound that made Lena's blood freeze, the distinct mechanical thunk of a deadbolt sliding home. They weren't being de-escalated. They were being held. Silence descended on the room, thick and suffocating. The muffled bass of the music from the ballroom thumped against the wall like a distant heartbeat. Lena stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking uncontrollably. The adrenaline that had spiked during the confrontation was crashing, leaving her lightheaded and terrified. "They locked us in," she whispered. "Marco, they locked us in." Marco paced the length of the small room, checking the single window. It was reinforced glass, looking out onto a sheer drop to the alleyway below. No exit. He turned to her, dragging a hand down his face. The composure he had maintained all night was fraying at the edges. "It is a holding cell," he admitted grimly. "They are waiting for instructions, or waiting for the crowd to thin out so they can move us without witnesses." "This is my fault," Lena said again, her voice rising in pitch. "I'm so stupid. I just wanted one night to feel like I wasn't a loser, and now I've got us killed." "Stop saying that," Marco snapped. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing her shoulders. His grip was hard, grounding. "You did not do this. Lena, my enemies did this. This is my world bleeding into yours." "But I brought you here," she argued, trying to pull away. But he held her fast. "If I hadn't been so selfish, you would be safe in your tower. I just wanted to show off. I just wanted you to see me as something other than your employee." "Is that what you think?" Marco asked, his voice rough. "You think I came here to help you show off?" "Why else would you come?" she cried, tears finally spilling over. "Why would a man like you waste time with a woman like me at a high school reunion?" "Because I couldn't let you go alone," Marco shouted back. The volume of his voice startled both of them. The silence that followed was electric. Marco stared down at her, his chest heaving. The mask was gone completely now. He looked raw. He looked terrified. "I have been trying to keep you away from this," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "For months. I keep you in the accounting department. I keep you on the legitimate side of the books. I tell myself that if I keep you at arm's length, you will be safe." He shook her gently. But then you looked at me with those sad eyes and told me about this reunion, and I knew I couldn't stay away. I couldn't let you walk into that room and feel small, because you are not small. Lena, you are the only thing in my life that feels real." Lena stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. "Marco, I care for you too much," he confessed, the words torn from him. "It is a weakness, and tonight my weakness has put you in a cage." Lena's trembling changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a vibration that started in her core and radiated outward. She looked at this powerful, dangerous man who was blaming himself for her safety, and something inside her broke open. "It's not a weakness," she whispered. She stepped into him. She didn't pull away. She pressed her forehead against his chest, right over his heart. She could hear it hammering against his ribs, fast and erratic, just like hers. "Tonight is the first time in my life I haven't felt invisible," she said into his shirt. "Even with the guns, even with the danger, being with you, it makes me feel like I exist, like I matter." Marco let out a ragged breath. His hands slid from her shoulders down her arms, soothing, possessive strokes that ignited fires wherever they touched. "You matter," he swore. "You matter more than the empire, more than the money." His hands reached her waist, pulling her in until there was no air left between them. The friction of her silk dress against his suit was a spark in the dark room. Lena looked up. Her eyes were wet, her lips parted. The fear was still there, but it was being consumed by a hunger that had been building for months in the quiet spaces of their office. "Marco," she breathed. He didn't wait. He crashed his mouth onto hers. This wasn't the tentative, gentle kiss from the balcony. This was desperate. It was the kiss of two people who knew they might not see the morning. It was fueled by adrenaline, by the terror of the situation, and by the undeniable magnetic pull that had been dragging them together since the day they met. Lena gasped, opening to him, her hands flying up to tangle in his hair. She pulled him closer, needing to feel the weight of him, the reality of him. Marco groaned low in his throat, one arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly, crushing her against him. His other hand cupped the back of her head, angling her for better access. He devoured her. He tasted like wine and danger and desperation. They stumbled backward, their bodies moving as one frantic entity. Lena's back hit the edge of the conference table. She didn't care. She hopped up onto it, pulling Marco between her legs, kneading him closer. Closer. His hands were everywhere, tracing the curve of her spine, gripping her hips, sliding over the silk of her dress as if he were trying to memorize the shape of her. Lena's fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, bunching it up, feeling the hard muscle beneath. The kiss deepened, becoming a rhythm, a language. It was a confession of everything they hadn't been able to say in the fluorescent light of the office. "I want you. I need you. I'm scared. I'm yours," breathing heavy and ragged. Marco broke the kiss to trail his lips down her jawline, biting lightly at the sensitive cord of her neck. Lena threw her head back, a sound escaping her throat that was half sob, half moan. "Lena," he rasped against her skin. "God, Lena." For a moment, the locked door didn't matter. The hitmen didn't matter. There was only the heat of his body, the scent of sandalwood, and the overwhelming realization that she would rather die in this room with him than live 1,000 years without him. Voices outside the door shattered the world. "Get the key. The boss wants them moved to the basement. Hurry up. We're on a timeline." The reality of their situation slammed back into the room like a physical intruder. Marco and Lena froze. They were pressed together, hearts pounding in unison, chests heaving. Lena's hands were still in his hair. His hands were still gripping her thighs. They stared at each other, eyes wide, pupils blown. The passion was still there, burning hot, but the ice of fear was creeping back in. Marco pulled away first. It looked physically painful for him to do so. He stepped back, running a hand over his mouth, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He smoothed his jacket, the mask of the dawn sliding back into place. Though it was cracked now, he reached out and cupped her face. His thumbs brushed away the tears on her cheeks. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent and low. When that door opens, there will be chaos. I am going to draw their fire. I am going to surrender." "What?" Lena grabbed his wrists. "No, it is the only way," Marco insisted. "I will offer myself in exchange for your safety. They want me. If I give them what they want, they have no reason to hurt you. You stay down. You wait for the police." "You can't do that," Lena hissed, anger flaring bright and hot in her chest. "You don't get to sacrifice yourself. You don't get to leave me. I will not let you die for my sins, Lena. And I won't let you die for my mistake," she shot back. She jumped off the table. Her mind was racing. The fear was still there, but the paralysis was gone. Her brain, the brain that managed complex logistics, that saw patterns in numbers, that memorized floor plans to soothe her anxiety, kicked into gear. She looked at the room, really looked at it. "The service door," she whispered. Marco looked at her. "There is no service door, just the main entrance." "No," Lena said, pointing to a narrow panel in the wood wainscoting near the corner. It looked like part of the wall, but there was a faint seam. "I studied the hotel schematics online before we came. I always check the exits. It's an anxiety thing. This room used to be 2 rooms. That panel covers an old pass-through to the AV closet." Marco looked at the panel, then back at her with a look of pure astonishment. "Are you sure?" "I'm an accountant. Marco," she said, grabbing a letter opener from the table. "I don't make mistakes with details." She jammed the letter opener into the seam and pried. With a groan of dry wood, the panel popped open. Behind it was a dark, dusty crawl space. "It leads to the AV closet," Lena said, her voice trembling but determined. "From there, we can access the service stairwell. It bypasses the elevators and dumps out into the loading dock." Footsteps stopped outside the main door. The jingle of keys. "They're opening it," Marco whispered. He looked at the small hole in the wall, then at Lena. He grabbed her hand and kissed the knuckles, a quick, fierce gesture of devotion. "Lead the way, Miss Hart." Lena didn't hesitate. She kicked off her high heels, gathered her silk skirt, and scrambled into the darkness of the wall. Marco followed her, pulling the panel shut just as the lock on the main door clicked open. They were in the dark, smelling of dust and old wires, but they were moving. Lena wasn't the damsel in distress anymore. She was the guide, and she was going to get them out. The concrete stairwell was cold and smelled of damp dust and old grease. The emergency lights cast a sickly yellow glow over the peeling paint as Lena Hart and Marco D'Alessandro descended, their footsteps echoing sharply against the metal risers. Lena was barefoot, clutching her heels in one hand, her other hand firmly encased in Marco's grip. They moved with urgency, flight rather than stealth. They had cleared 2 floors when the door on the landing below them burst open. One of the men from the bar stepped out. He was not looking for a bathroom. He was looking for them. In his hand, held low against his thigh but unmistakable in the yellow light, was a pistol with a suppressor screwed onto the barrel. Lena stopped so abruptly she almost slipped. Marco didn't skid. He turned to stone instantly, his arm shooting out to shove Lena behind the heavy steel of the stairwell door frame. "Going somewhere." "Mr. D'Alessandro?" the man asked. His voice was casual, terrifyingly mundane for a man holding a gun. "Just leaving the party," Marco said, his voice level. He stood on the landing, hands open, showing he was unarmed. "You can tell your employer I declined the invitation." "He insists," the man said, raising the weapon. The distance between them was less than 6 feet. In the movies, people talked. In Marco's world, physics took over as the man's finger tightened on the trigger. Marco moved. He didn't dive away. He dove forward, closing the gap. The gun coughed, a sharp, compressed sound like a heavy book being slammed shut. Lena screamed, a sound that tore from her throat before she could stop it. Marco slammed into the gunman, driving his shoulder into the man's chest. The impact threw the assassin back against the concrete wall with a bone-jarring thud. The gun skittered across the landing, clattering down the next flight of stairs. It wasn't a choreographed fight scene. It was a messy, brutal struggle for survival. The man tried to knee Marco. Marco blocked it and drove a short, vicious elbow into the man's temple. The man's knees buckled. Marco followed up with a heavy blow to the jaw, and the man slumped to the floor, unconscious. Silence returned to the stairwell, heavy and ringing. Marco stood over the fallen man for a second, chest heaving, ensuring the threat was neutralized. Then he turned to Lena. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes scanning her frantically. "No," she gasped, stepping out from the doorway. "I'm fine. Marco, you—" She stopped, her eyes fixed on his side. The white dress shirt, visible beneath his unbuttoned tuxedo jacket, was no longer white. A dark, rapidly spreading stain was blooming just above his hip. "You're shot," she whispered, the color draining from her face. Marco looked down, touching the spot gingerly. He pulled his hand away, and his fingers were red. "It is a graze. He missed the vital organs. It looks worse than it is." "We need to stop," Lena said, her voice shaking but authoritative. "We need to check it." "We need to leave," Marco countered, though he winced as he straightened up. "We are not going anywhere until I see that it isn't an artery," Lena insisted. She grabbed his arm, her fear transforming into a frantic, focused energy. "There was a housekeeping break room on the floor map, just down this hall. Come on." She didn't wait for his permission. She pulled him through the door the gunman had entered, dragging the Mafia boss into a small, fluorescent-lit lounge filled with vending machines and a smell of stale coffee. She pushed him toward a vinyl chair. "Sit." Marco sat, his face pale but his eyes alert, watching the door. Lena scanned the room. A first aid kit was mounted on the wall near the sink. She ripped it open, spilling packets of gauze and antiseptic wipes onto the counter. She knelt between his legs, her hands trembling as she reached for the hem of his shirt. "I need to see it," she said, her voice barely audible. Marco watched her. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a searing pain in his side, but he barely felt it. All he could feel was her presence. "Do it," he murmured. Lena gently peeled back the ruined fabric of his shirt. The bullet had torn a furrow along his left side, just above the hip bone. It was angry and bleeding sluggishly, but she could see it hadn't penetrated the abdominal cavity. "Oh, God," she breathed, tears pricking her eyes. "It is a flesh wound," Marco said softly. "I have had worse shaving cuts." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, ripping open an antiseptic wipe. "This is going to sting." She pressed the wipe to the wound. Marco hissed, his abdominal muscles seizing under her hands, the sudden tension of his body beneath her fingers, hard, reactive, alive, sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with medicine. She worked quickly, cleaning the blood away. Her hands were shaking, but her touch was incredibly gentle. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She could smell the iron tang of blood mixed with his cologne. As she taped a thick pad of gauze over the wound, their faces were inches apart. She was concentrating so hard, her tongue caught between her teeth, her brows furrowed. Marco reached out, his hand, heavy and warm, covered hers, stopping her movements. "Lena," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were wide, glassy with unshed tears. "I am scared," Marco admitted. Lena froze. "It's okay. We stopped the bleeding. You're going to be okay." "Not of the bullet," Marco corrected. His thumb stroked the back of her hand. "I am scared of what happens when we walk out of here. I am scared that you will look at this." He gestured to the blood, the gun on the floor outside, the violence, "and you will realize that no amount of money or passion is worth this chaos. I am scared you will choose safety." Lena stared at him. The silence in the small room was thick enough to drown in. "You took a bullet for me," she whispered. "I would take 1,000, he said simply. "Do you know how many people have stood up for me in my life?" Lena asked, her voice cracking. "0. Not my teachers, not my friends, certainly not the boys I dated. When things got hard or when people were cruel, I was always alone." She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his shoulder, careful of the wound. "You are the first person who has ever stood between me and harm," she said into his neck. "You didn't join in the laughter. You didn't look away. You fought." She pulled back to look him in the eye. "That matters, Marco. That matters more than whatever name the world gives you. It matters more than the danger." Marco looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. He raised his hand to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing her lip. "You are reckless. Lena Hart. Maybe, she said, leaning into his touch. Or maybe I'm just finally seeing clearly. Before the moment could deepen, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway. Radios crackled. Clear on the stairwell. Suspect down. Check the rooms. Sweep the floor. The police had arrived. Marco pulled away, his face hardening back into the mask of the dawn. He buttoned his jacket, wincing slightly, hiding the bandage and the blood. "Let me do the talking," he commanded softly. "You know nothing. You saw nothing. We were hiding." The door burst open. 3 police officers with drawn weapons filled the frame. "Hands! Let me see your hands." 10 minutes later, they were escorted back up to the ballroom. The atmosphere had shifted from festive to funereal. The house lights were fully on, casting a harsh, unflattering glare on the remaining guests. The music was off. People were clustered in groups, whispering furiously. When Marco and Lena were led in by the police, a hush fell over the room. It wasn't a respectful silence. It was the silence of judgment. Lena felt the weight of their stares. She was barefoot. Her hair was coming loose, and she was holding Marco's arm as if he were the only solid thing on earth. "That's him," someone whispered loud enough to carry. "The guy with the helicopter. I heard he's mob. Did you see the blood on his shirt? Lena brought this here." Seriously, what was she thinking? The rumors had evidently traveled faster than the elevator. The guests had turned on her. The fear of the lockdown had curdled into blame. And Lena was the easiest target. A police detective, a weary-looking man with gray stubble, stopped them near the center of the room. "Mr. D'Alessandro," the detective said, glancing at his notepad, "we found an unconscious man in the stairwell with a serious concussion. We also found a firearm. You want to tell me what happened?" Marco stood tall. He didn't look like a man who had just been shot. He looked like he owned the police department. "I encountered an armed individual attempting to rob guests." Marco lied smoothly. He became aggressive. "I defended myself and Miss Hart. I believe he slipped on the stairs." "Slipped?" The detective raised an eyebrow. "It was very slippery," Marco said deadpan. "I did not get his name. I just wanted to ensure the safety of the civilians. And the blood on your side? I snagged it on a railing," Marco said. "Miss Hart was assisting me. She was distressed." He was taking it all. He was painting himself as a vague participant to keep Lena out of the witness box, to keep her name off the police report as an accessory to gang violence. "Distressed is one word for it," a voice called out. Ryan Blake pushed his way through the circle of onlookers. He looked flushed, eager to insert himself into the drama. "Officer, I tried to tell her," Ryan said, looking from the detective to the crowd, playing to his audience. "I warned Lena earlier tonight. I told her this guy was bad news. I told her she was getting mixed up in things she didn't understand." He turned to Lena, shaking his head with mock sympathy. "I mean, come on, Lena. You bring a guy like this to a family event? You had to know something like this would happen. You always were." "What's the word?" "A little desperate for attention." The room murmured in agreement. "Yeah, putting us all in danger just to show off." Classic Lena. She probably hired him to make us jealous. The shame hit Lena like a physical wave. It was high school all over again. The gym, the cafeteria, the collective finger pointing at her, telling her she was wrong, she was bad, she was the problem. She looked at Chelsea, who was standing with her arms crossed, looking smug. She looked at Ryan, who was preening for the cops. She looked at Marco. He was about to speak, his jaw set in a line of fury, ready to destroy Ryan verbally or physically. Lena squeezed his arm. No. She let go of him. She took a step forward, away from Marco's protection, into the center of the harsh light, her bare feet planted firmly on the carpet. "Desperate for attention?" Lena repeated. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the room, it carried to every corner. Ryan smirked. "I'm just saying, Lena, you have a history of drama." "Drama," Lena said. She looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time in 10 years, she didn't see the golden boy. She saw a peaked, insecure bully in a cheap suit. Is drama what you call it when you forged a love letter in 10th grade to lure me behind the bleachers so the entire football team could laugh at me? The smirk dropped from Ryan's face. What? I didn't... You signed it, Lena interrupted, her voice gaining strength. You waited until I got there. You watched me cry. You didn't look away then. Ryan, you laughed the hardest. She turned to Chelsea. And you, Lena said. Chelsea flinched. You locked me in the equipment shed during a thunderstorm in junior year because I sat at the wrong table at lunch. I was in there for 3 hours. You told the teacher I had gone home sick. The room was deadly silent. The murmurs had stopped. You called me a loser, Lena said, looking around the circle of faces. You posted videos of me tripping. You threw food at me. You made me feel like I was a waste of space. For 4 years. You broke me down, piece by piece. Just because you could. She took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steel. I didn't bring this danger here tonight for attention, she said. I came here because I wanted to prove to myself that I survived you. I wanted to walk into this room and realize that you don't own me anymore. She pointed at Ryan. You are not a hero. Ryan, you are a bully who peaked at 18. And you, she gestured to the crowd, you are just people. Petty, mean people who are terrified that someone else might be happy. She stepped back to Marco's side. I am not worthless, she said, her voice breaking slightly on the last word, but holding, and I am done apologizing for existing. Marco watched her. His expression was a mixture of shock and fierce, burning pride. He looked at her as if she had just conquered a nation. He reached out and took her hand, interlacing their fingers in front of everyone, the cops, the bullies, the world. Miss Hart is correct, Marco said to the detective, his voice cold and final. We are leaving. Unless you intend to arrest the victims? The detective looked at Ryan, who was staring at his shoes, his face beet red. He looked at the silent, shamed crowd. He looked at the bullet graze on Marco's side. Go, the detective grunted. But don't leave town. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and black under the streetlights. The air was cold, washed clean by the storm. They stood under the hotel awning. The valet was bringing the helicopter pilot's car around, as the chopper was now a crime scene. Behind them, the police were taking statements. Lena could hear the low murmur of the officers talking into their radios. D'Alessandro? Yeah. Check the files. Organized crime division. Keep eyes on him. The reality of the night was settling in. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by exhaustion and the throbbing ache of bruises. Marco turned to her. The harsh lights of the hotel entrance illuminated the lines of pain around his eyes. Lena, he said softly. Don't, she warned. You heard them, Marco said, gesturing back toward the cops. They are going to be watching. The rivals know I am vulnerable. Us. He gestured between them. It puts a target on your back, a permanent one. I know, she said. You should go, Marco said, though the words seemed to choke him. Walk away. Go back to your apartment, quit the job. I will give you severance that will last a lifetime. Go somewhere safe where no one knows the name D'Alessandro. He stepped back, creating physical distance between them. I cannot protect you from everything, Lena. Tonight proved that. If you stay, there will be more nights like this. There will be fear. There will be blood. Lena looked at him. She saw the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. He was trying to do the noble thing. He was trying to be the hero Ryan pretended to be. She felt a surge of anger. You don't get to decide for me, she said. It is for your own good, he pleaded. Screw my own good, Lena shouted. She stepped right into his space, grabbing the lapels of his tuxedo jacket and yanking him down. She kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was angry. It was desperate. It was a collision of teeth and lips and frustration. It was a claim. She poured everything into it, the fear of the stairwell, the shame of the ballroom, the rage at Ryan, and the overwhelming, terrifying love she felt for this dangerous man. You don't get to push me away, she murmured against his mouth. I don't want Safe. I had Safe. Safe was sitting alone in my apartment, feeling like I was dead inside. Safe was being invisible. She pulled back, breathing hard, her hand still gripping his jacket. "I choose this," she said fiercely. "I choose the danger. I choose the fear, because when I'm with you, I'm alive. I'm real." Marco stared at her, stunned by her ferocity. The resolve to push her away crumbled in the face of her fire. The kiss softened. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into him, burying his face in her hair. It became tender, slow and deep. He held her like she was the only solid thing in a world that was spinning off its axis. His hands stroked her back in long, reassuring lines, grounding her, claiming her in return. "I cannot promise it will be easy," he whispered into her hair. "I don't want easy," she replied, her voice muffled against his chest. "I just want you—" "Then you have me," Marco vowed, "for as long as I have breath." The black sedan pulled up to the curb. "Where to, boss?" the driver asked, eyeing the police presence nervously. Marco looked at Lena. "Not the apartment, not the penthouse. Somewhere quiet." "The lake house," the driver suggested. Marco nodded. "The lake house." He opened the door for her. Lena didn't look back at the hotel. She didn't look back at the classmates who were now watching from the windows. She slid into the car, intertwining her fingers with Marco's as he sat beside her. As the car pulled away, disappearing into the dark, wet streets of Harborview, Lena rested her head on his shoulder. The future was uncertain. The police were watching, the rivals were waiting. But for the first time in 10 years, Lena Hart wasn't scared of what people thought. She was exactly where she belonged. The black sedan had barely left the curb when the driver slammed on the brakes. Tires screeched against the wet pavement, throwing Lena forward against her seatbelt. "Boss," the driver said, his voice tight. "They have blocked the avenue. 3 SUVs. It is a kill box." Marco swore in Italian, a harsh, guttural sound. He looked out the window, his eyes scanning the dark street. Blue police lights were flashing near the hotel entrance. But down the road, shadows were moving that had nothing to do with law enforcement. The streets were compromised. "Turn around," Marco commanded. "Go back to the service bay." "The hotel?" Lena asked, panic flaring in her chest. "Marco, we just left. The police are there." "The police are busy with the crowd," Marco said, his hand gripping hers tightly. "And the streets are a trap. The storm has cleared. The only way out is up." He pulled out his phone. "Jack, start the rotors. We are coming back up." The car reversed aggressively, tires smoking, and whipped back into the hotel's underground loading dock before the rival SUVs could close the distance. They abandoned the vehicle next to a dumpster and sprinted for the service elevator. The ride up was agonizingly slow. The industrial elevator rattled and groaned, smelling of garbage and bleach. Lena leaned against the metal wall, her energy draining away. The adrenaline that had fueled her speech in the ballroom was fading, leaving her limbs heavy and trembling. But despite the exhaustion, despite the fear, she felt lighter. The crushing weight of 10 years of shame was gone. She had looked Ryan Blake in the eye and told him the truth. She had exposed Chelsea. She had broken the silence. She looked at Marco. He was checking the magazine of a pistol he had taken from the driver. His face was pale from the blood loss of the graze on his side, but he stood like a statue of resolve. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Marco looked at her. The hardness in his eyes softened instantly. "I should be asking you that. I dragged you back into the fire." "We go together," Lena said. It wasn't a question. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open to the rooftop. They stepped out into the night wind, expecting the roar of the helicopter and a quick escape. Instead, they walked into a standoff. 2 men were waiting. They were not the same men from the bar. These were heavier, wearing tactical vests over their dark clothing. They stood between the elevator housing and the helicopter. The pilot, Jack, was pinned down behind a stack of crates near the landing pad, a gun pointed at his head by one of the attackers. The second gunman turned as the elevator doors opened. He raised an assault rifle. "Back inside," Marco roared, shoving Lena hard. He threw her behind a concrete generator housing just as bullets chipped away the stone inches from where her head had been. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack, crack, crack that echoed over the city. Marco returned fire, his handgun booming twice. He ducked behind the steel pillar of the elevator shaft. "Stay down," Marco yelled to her. "Do not move." Lena huddled against the cold concrete, her hands over her ears. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She was safe behind the generator. But Marco was pinned. The gunmen had the angle. They were suppressing him, keeping him trapped while they maneuvered to flank him. If they got around the pillar, Marco was dead. Lena looked around. Panic tried to claw at her throat, telling her to curl into a ball and wait for the end. But the voice of the scared girl from high school was silent tonight. In its place was the woman who had navigated a corporate audit, the woman who had cleaned a bullet wound, the woman who had chosen the dangerous man. "Think," she told herself. "Look at the problem. Find the variable." She scanned the rooftop. To her right, running along the base of the parapet, was a yellow-painted maintenance path. It was narrow, shadowed by the large air conditioning units. The gunmen were focused on Marco and the pilot. They weren't looking at the edge of the roof. Lena's eyes followed the yellow line. It led to a gray metal box mounted on the wall near the helipad, the emergency control panel. She knew what was in there. She had memorized the safety schematics of every D'Alessandro building she worked in. It was a compulsion, a way to control her anxiety. That box contained the manual override for the helipad's floodlights and the building's fire suppression alarm. If she could get there. She looked at Marco. He was firing blindly around the corner, trying to buy time, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. He looked at her, his eyes pleading with her to stay safe. Lena shook her head. Not this time. She kicked off her heels, staying low, moving on hands and knees. She slipped into the shadow of the AC unit. The wind covered the sound of her movement. The gunmen were shouting at Marco, demanding he surrender. "Give it up, D'Alessandro. There is nowhere to go." Lena crawled along the maintenance path. The rough gravel of the roof bit into her palms and knees. Her silk dress snagged on a bolt, tearing. But she didn't stop. She was 10 feet away. 5. She reached the control box. It was locked with a simple latch. She took a deep breath. She could see the gunman with the rifle. He was moving, stepping away from the helicopter to get a clear shot at Marco. He was seconds away from ending it. Lena yanked the latch open. She didn't hesitate. She slammed her hand down on the large red button labeled Emergency Override and flipped the breaker for the perimeter floods. The effect was instantaneous and blinding. 12 industrial-grade halogen floodlights, aimed directly at the center of the pad, flashed on simultaneously. The sudden transition from darkness to blinding white light was disorienting. At the exact same second, the fire alarm shrieked, a piercing mechanical wail that vibrated in the teeth. The gunman with the rifle stumbled back, throwing a hand up to shield his eyes, his night vision destroyed. "Now!" Lena screamed, though she couldn't even hear herself over the alarm. Marco didn't need to be told. He was a creature of instinct. As soon as the light flared, he moved. He broke cover, sprinting across the gap while the gunman was blinded. He didn't fire. He closed the distance and used the pistol as a club, striking the man across the face with brutal force. The gunman went down hard. The second man, the one guarding the pilot, panicked. The noise, the lights, the sudden reversal, it broke his nerve. He fired a wild shot into the air and scrambled toward the fire escape stairs on the far side of the roof. Abandoning the fight, Marco didn't chase him. He spun around, his chest heaving, searching the roof. "Lena!" She stood up near the control box, her knees bleeding, her dress torn, her hair a wild halo around her face. She looked like a disaster. She looked magnificent. Marco crossed the distance in 3 long strides. He didn't say a word. He grabbed her, pulling her against him with a force that knocked the breath out of her. He buried his face in her neck, his grip so tight it was almost painful. "You are insane," he breathed against her skin. "You are absolutely insane." "I helped," she gasped, clinging to him. "You saved us," he corrected. He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. The alarm was still shrieking, the lights were still blinding, but in the circle of his arms, everything was quiet. "I told you to stay down. I don't take orders well anymore," she said, a breathless laugh escaping her. In the distance, rising above the mechanical wail of the alarm, came the sound of police sirens, lots of them. "We have to go," Marco said. Jack, get us in the air!" The pilot, shaken but unharmed, scrambled into the cockpit. The rotors began to spin, the whine building to a roar that rivaled the alarm. They stood by the open door of the helicopter. The wind buffeted them, tugging at Marco's jacket and Lena's ruined dress. "This is it!" Marco shouted over the noise. "This is my life. Lena, chaos, violence. It will never be simple. Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure?" Lena looked at him. She looked at the blood on his shirt. She looked at the gun tucked into his waistband. Then she looked at the fierce, terrified love in his eyes. "My life was never simple," she yelled back. "It was just lonely. I was suffering alone in a quiet room. I would rather be in the storm with you." Marco looked at her as if she had just given him the world. He didn't pull her into the helicopter yet. He stepped closer. The city of Harborview was spread out below them, a grid of indifferent lights. The night was breaking, a faint line of gray appearing on the eastern horizon. He pulled her into his arms. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear of who was watching, no worry about the timeline. He kissed her. It was deep, unhurried, and all-consuming. It was a kiss that tasted of survival. His hands slid from her face to her back, pressing her body flush against his, letting her feel every beat of his heart. Lena's fingers laced behind his neck, anchoring herself to him, pulling him down. They stood on the edge of the roof, bathed in the harsh floodlights, kissing as if the world were ending and they were the only two people left to restart it. It was a declaration. It was a promise. Finally, Marco broke the kiss, breathless. He rested his forehead against hers for 1 second, then turned and helped her into the helicopter. They buckled in side by side. The aircraft lurched, then lifted smoothly into the air. Lena looked out the window. The Grand Hotel shrank below them. She could see the flashing lights of the police cars surrounding the entrance. She could imagine the guests inside, Ryan, Chelsea, the people who had made her feel small for half her life, still gossiping, still judging, still stuck in the same room talking about the same old stories. She watched the hotel disappear until it was just another light in the city. She didn't care. She turned away from the window. She reached out and took Marco's hand. He squeezed her fingers tight, interlacing them with his own. She rested her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes as they flew toward the dawn. The penthouse was quiet. It was a stark contrast to the noise of the night. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic of the waking city 40 floors below. Lena and Marco sat on the expansive leather sofa. Their shoes were kicked off near the door. Marco's ruined tuxedo jacket was draped over a chair. He had changed the bandage on his side, wearing only a clean white t-shirt and his dress trousers. Lena rested her head on his shoulder. Her legs curled up under her. Marco's arm was draped around her, his hand idly stroking her hair. They had been sitting in silence for 20 minutes, just breathing. "The police will want to talk to you again," Marco said quietly, his voice rumbling in his chest. "I know," Lena murmured. "I can hire lawyers, the best ones. They can keep you out of it." "I don't want to be kept out of it," Lena said. She lifted her head to look at him. "I'm not hiding anymore. Marco, not from the police, not from the rumors." Marco looked at her, his dark eyes tracing the features of her face. "You could leave the city. We could leave. I have accounts in Zurich, properties in Tuscany. We could disappear. Is that what you want?" Lena asked. "To run?" Marco hesitated. "I want you safe. If staying here means fighting a war every day, I am tired of war, Lena." "Then we leave," she said softly. "Someday. But not because we're running away. We leave when we're ready to start something new. Together." "Together," Marco repeated, testing the word. He liked the sound of it. "But first," Lena said, touching the bandage on his side, "we heal, and I have a lot of vacation days saved up." Marco smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. It made him look younger, less like a mob boss and more like a man who had finally found home. "I suppose the D'Alessandro Group can spare its best analyst for a few weeks," he teased. The conversation trailed off. There was nothing left to say. The sun was fully up now, casting a warm gold light across the living room floor. They turned toward each other, their noses brushed. This kiss was different, It wasn't fueled by adrenaline or fear. It was slow. It was reverent. It was soft lips moving against soft lips, a gentle exploration of the new reality they had built in the span of 12 hours. Marco's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin. Lena closed her eyes, leaning into him, feeling the steady thrum of his pulse. The camera of the story pulled back, leaving them there on the sofa, bathed in morning light, two broken people who had fit their jagged edges together to make something whole. Their future was uncertain, fraught with danger and legal battles and public scrutiny, but as long as their hands were enshrined, they were invincible. Epilogue. 3 days later, the internet was burning. The video of the helicopter landing had gone viral. Then the video of the police arrival. Then the rumors. Helicopter Girl was trending locally. The headlines were sensational. Mob boss and mystery date crash reunion? From class loser to mob queen? Comments flooded Lena's social media. Is that Lena Hart? No way. I heard she orchestrated the whole thing. She looks amazing, though. Not gonna lie. Ryan Blake is crying in the comments, LOL. Lena sat at the kitchen island of the penthouse, scrolling through the feed on her phone. She read the speculation. She read the judgment. She read the awe. 10 years ago, this would have destroyed her. She would have locked herself in her room and cried for days. She looked at the screen one last time. Then, she turned the phone face down on the marble counter. She stood up and walked to the sliding glass doors. She stepped out onto the balcony. The air was fresh, smelling of the ocean. Marco was standing at the railing, looking out over his city. He turned as she approached, opening his arm to welcome her. Lena stepped into his embrace. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. They are still talking, Marco noted, nodding toward the phone inside. Let them talk, Lena said, resting her arms on the railing. They're just noise. Marco kissed the top of her head. And what are we? Lena looked out at the horizon, where the sky met the sea. She felt the warmth of the man beside her, the man who had flown through a storm to hold her hand. We, Lena said, smiling, are the main character. They stood there together, watching the city below, no longer hiding who they were or what they felt, ready to face whatever came next. Side by side. Thank you so much for listening to The class loser of the class was invited to the 10 years reunion. She came by helicopter with Mafia boss. I hope you enjoyed Lana and Marco's journey from the shadows into the light. I would love to hear where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below telling me your country or city. And if you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to the Mafia Romance Stories channel for more tales of passion, danger, and redemption. Share your thoughts on the ending in English in the comments section. I read every single one. Until next time.